Okay, welcome, welcome, welcome. This has been a long journey. Last year, we've been preparing for all of this. It's turned out to be a very personal journey, which gets me choked up every once in a while, so, like right now. So, there may be some pregnant pauses as I recollect myself. First of all, my name's Mark Schaefer. I represent the Carnegie Historical Museum here in Fairfield. Once we're done here, we're going to go to the cemetery, and nobody has to get out of their cars. You can see the centerpiece grave from the street, and we'll put one of the Juneteenth flags at Yancey's grave, and then proceed to the museum. Or you can go directly to the museum. It's your call. I don't know, have the maps been passed out?
Yes.
Okay, so you've got a map of Evergreen Cemetery with the important graves on it. And some of this is stream of consciousness. I'm just going to say it while I'm thinking of it. I started out thinking I was going to have a little luncheon for 6 or 8 people, and each of those people would get a flag to put on a grave. Well, it grew, and I had ordered flags twice, and I could have ordered a third time, but I thought 11 graves is plenty. It tells the story. So anyway, the story is the Underground Railroad. And the first thing I need to do is define it. A lot of people have this literal idea that it was underground, tunnels from Memphis, Tennessee, on up to Cincinnati or whatever. Maybe a tunnel here and there, but mostly under the cover of darkness and through stream beds and deserted cornfields and that sort of thing, hiding in people's homes or barns. But basically, the Underground Network of Railroad, the Underground Railroad Network, it was a secret network of safe houses transporting enslaved freedom seekers along the treacherous journey north to Canada. And there were even some routes that went into Mexico. Another thing that I learned, when Texas was the Lone Star Republic, I don't think they had slavery. And then when they came into the Union, it became legal again. When Texas was part of Mexico, that was it. I think slavery had been outlawed. So it's a weird kind of seesawing back and forth between liberation and emancipation and enslavement and so forth. The Juneteenth flag has an interesting symbolism. The banner that's here beside me on the piano and on the podium dates to the 1990s. But what was originally called Emancipation Day dates back to August 1st, I think, let's just say mid-1830s. I don't remember the exact year. But that's been a day celebrated by the black community as a sign of hope. That was 1830s, let's say 5-ish, just a couple of years before Fairfield was founded. And August 1st became Emancipation Day. And then later became Juneteenth, because that's June 19th, like you see on the banner, 1865. That was the last group of slaves that were emancipated in Galveston, Texas, when the last remnant of Confederate forces surrendered to Union Army people. So it's been a long, long journey to freedom, and has just become a national holiday 1 year and 1 day ago today. The Juneteenth flag has multiple meanings, like I said. So it began as the Emancipation Day for the end of slavery in the British West Indies. And then this flag has the 5-pointed star that represents Texas, the Lone Star State. The bursting nova, or new star, represents the end of slavery. The arc between the red and blue fields represents a new horizon. The red, white, and blue, of course, symbolizes the American flag. And like I said, the June 19th, 1865 notation marks the last group of Southern slaves to be informed of their emancipation. I have a huge note of thanks to offer Mr. Rory Goff, Goff. He spent 10 years researching the Underground Railroad and emancipation connections here in Fairfield and Jefferson County. His book is over 700 pages long, with 400 entries. Some of the biographical information runs several pages on some of the people. And it's real confusing to read because all these abolitionist families intermarried. And so on one page, so-and-so is a first cousin once removed from somebody. And then 2 pages later, he's a next door neighbor's second wife or, whatever. It's very convoluted, but it's fascinating. And like I said earlier, this has become a very personal journey. I was reading Goff's book one day, researching our exhibit at the museum, and it said, a James Clapp bought Nancy Yancey's house. That's my great-great-grandfather. He bought the premier person, the centerpiece of our observance today is Nancy Yancey, a free black woman whose husband and she were Underground Railroad operators here in Fairfield. My grandmother remembers the grandparents that bought the house from her 6 months before she died. So that really brings it close. The hill that we went sledding on when I was a kid on the farm north of town, that was the north end of our property. It was a high point in the neighborhood. The people that homesteaded that ground in the 1840s had, the patriarch of the family had been the first Massachusetts state legislator to be elected on an abolition anti-slavery ticket. So it really brings things home. So I'm going to quit yakking, and I'm going to ask my brother Herb Schaefer to talk about the American Home Missionary Society and its regional impact to Fairfield.
60 years ago, I did not get the last word. Oh, well.
Oh, I get it. I get it. I'm the oldest.
I'm here today to speak about a national organization that was called the American Home Missionary Society, and many values that we live by are faith-based. And the American Home Missionary Society was an organized endeavor on behalf of churches in the eastern United States to bring the gospel message and civilizing values to the far west. And in the 1840s, when this was a fledgling community and all our southeast Iowa communities were young and just beginning, we had some room to grow in becoming a part of the American culture. There are three particular values that seem to be prominent in the American Home Missionary Society among those missionaries who were sent to this region in this new Iowa territory. Two vices that the missionaries were against were saloons and slavery. And the one value that they were for was universal public education. Many of these values came from the New England culture, and those were the driving moral forces behind those who were the missionaries in our very communities, whether they were Fairfield or Keosauqua or Mount Pleasant or Salem or Burlington, Washington, and on through Iowa City and over to Davenport and beyond. My beginning place in interest in this was studying a store ledger book from 1847 from Bentonsport, Iowa, noticing the names of the people who had store accounts, and that's the way people did in those days. They kept a running account because cash money was so hard to come by. And occasionally there'd be an interesting name, like the Reverend Erastus P. Ripley. I thought, well, who has a $3 name like that? And so I did some research, found out that he was a missionary for the American Home Missionary Society, and he was sent to the Iowa Territory and assigned to a little place called Bentonsport. Well, that led to my finding that it was possible to read letters of correspondence these missionaries sent to the home office back in New York. In fact, they were required to send reports 4 times a year if they wished to receive their quarterly pay for their work. And they would reflect in those letters the immediate circumstances of a community, the moral values or moral issues of the community, the successes they were having in making progress forward in the community, and how desperately poor the community was, and that's why we need help from the folks back east. As I began reading these letters for this one particular community of Bentonsport, then I saw the name of Julius Reed, who had been assigned at Fairfield. I began to talk to my brother about that and discovered that the layers of connection were deep and far-reaching in their work. In the 1840s, the thought of being an abolitionist was a scandalous and detestable thing to be known by. An abolitionist was thought of one who was there to cause trouble, one who was upsetting the equilibrium of American society. But and many of the people settling in this part of the Iowa Territory had roots in the American South, from Tennessee or Kentucky or maybe North Carolina. And in so doing, they were accustomed to certain values that had always been in place. But because of the influence of these missionaries from the American Home Missionary Society, the culture in Iowa began to change. And by the 1850s, after the Missouri Compromise, after the Compromise of 1850 that made it a federal offense to be assisting someone in an escape to freedom, Iowa's values began to change from being neutral, passive, or maybe even slightly favorable to the institution of slavery to being a culture that was very much against it. And so I want to speak just briefly about how that was through the movement of the American Home Missionary Society. First of all, back in that day, there were some code words, if you will, about the kind of people who might be suspect to be abolitionists. If they were called a Yankee, they might be an abolitionist. If they were a New School Presbyterian, they might be an abolitionist. If they were a Free Methodist, they were an abolitionist. And if they were a Congregationalist, it was almost certain that they were abolitionists in their leanings. In fact, in 1848, the Congregational pastor in Farmington, Iowa, writes that he'd come back from the annual national meeting and the whole town is in an uproar because there have been some runaways pass through town, and the townsfolk who were of a traditional point of view that slaves should be sent back home to their master, they were all up in arms that it was the fault of the Congregationalists. They threatened to burn their church house, which had been completed just 6 months before. They threatened to burn the mills and the businesses of the Congregationalist church members, all in the name of putting down their radical kind of views. So it was not a pleasant thing to be an abolitionist in those early days, but after the years pass, that begins to change. Julius Reed was the Congregational pastor in Fairfield. He was sent by the American Home Missionary Society. He and a man by the name of Asa Turner, who was a Presbyterian pastor in Denmark, Iowa, they had together been early supporters of the abolition movement when they were preachers in Illinois. They were friends of a man by the name of Elijah P. Lovejoy, who was a Presbyterian and published an abolitionist publication, first in St. Louis and then in Alton, Illinois. Asa Turner was presiding at the organizational meeting for the Illinois Abolitionist Society, which evolved into a riot against Elijah Lovejoy for his publication of his anti-slavery newspaper, and in the process, Lovejoy was murdered. That became part of the start of a national movement to undo slavery, and Iowa's connections are very close there. So if you were to read the letters of correspondence from Julius Reed, December of 1841, he says, I helped establish a church at Brighton and a church at Keosauqua this fall. Brighton became a stopping point on the way north and east in the Underground Railroad, and Keosauqua, the preacher who was assigned there, was a young man whose father was an Underground Railroad operative in Ripley, Ohio, by the name of Rankin. And this young Lowry Rankin found the inspiration to become a preacher when he saw what humiliating and dehumanizing impact people bound in chains on a riverboat had on him emotionally. He says, I have to do something to undo this. And because of that, he chose to go to seminary. But like some of us, he wasn't really prepared for advanced education. And so the seminary president, whose name was Beecher, and one of the seminary professors, whose name was Stowe, offered to tutor him for a year to help him come up to standard academically so he could pursue his studies. Maybe you know the names Beecher and Stowe together. Harriet Beecher Stowe. Dr. Beecher was Harriet's father. Dr. Stowe was Harriet's husband. She was gathering information about real-life stories of people struggling to make their way to freedom. And young Lowry Rankin provided some of that information, including the story of how he and his brothers aided a young mother who had crossed the Ohio River on ice floes with her baby in arms to find their way safely north. That was young Lowry Rankin. He was sent to the Iowa Territory, assigned to Van Buren County with his headquarters at Keosauqua. Those were the beginning points of stations for a network to help people find their way to freedom because of the value that God's love for the world is meant to be literally so, to be all-encompassing, and that each person has the right to life and to dignity. And I'll make one closing comment. I think you're going to hear a little piece about an episode at Birmingham, Iowa. And one brief mention in that story is about the Gould farm. These runaways are suspected to have shown up at the Gould farm, and they are not found there. I checked out about the Gould. Samuel Gould was a New School Presbyterian. And this was his value, according to his son's autobiography in the Jefferson Van Buren County biographical album from 1890. He considered it wrong that one should be deprived of his property without compensation, but he accounted it a far greater wrong that men should be deprived of their God-given liberty without consent. Values that we live by, and the American Home Missionary Society contributed to the values that became almost universal when the time really mattered in the middle of the 19th century. So thank you.
Thank you, Herb. So Christy Dougherty, representing the Pearson House in Keosauqua, is next. And she and her friend Mindy are dressed in appropriate costume. I told her she didn't have to, but
I made him do it.
we appreciate
No,
her
it's
spirit.
our pleasure to give you a glimpse into what a dress of the time period would have been like. And if you wish to approach us later and ask about any details, we'd be glad to answer your questions if we can. So the story that Herb was referring to was about slave catchers coming up, Southerners, to seek two runaways. And I'm going to read sections from an article written by Ralph Arnold, who was a leading historian of Van Buren County. He passed away, but I remember him. You know, I'm getting to be an old fart, so I can still remember him. Foster Anderson was the one telling this story. He said that there were two runaways, a weak elderly man and a young robust fellow, easily worth $1,200 to $1,500 to his master, and that they appeared in Birmingham. Well, shortly after they came, two bounty hunters came hot on their trail. This family that lived in Mount Zion had seen them go past their farm, and they were not abolitionists. They were Southern sympathizers. So they told the bounty hunters they were headed for Samuel Gould's place. The runaways were not found at Gould's, so the bounty hunters continued on to Birmingham. They checked in at Jimmy Steele's hotel. Now, Jimmy Steele was a one-armed man, and he was a Democrat, and he had been raised in the South. So the bounty hunters, knowing this, just assumed that he was a Southern sympathizer. And that was a good place for them to make their headquarters. Well, they had their dinner, and they put their horses in the livery barn, and they kind of settled in. They gave Jimmy their pistols and weapons because they wanted to go out to the Methodist campgrounds. Now, you've heard of campgrounds where there would be a religious revival meeting going on. And that was likely to be a place they would find additional information about runaway slaves, because you know those Methodists. So they took off, went to the campgrounds, and someone there said, well, now that you mention it, I did see a large, very dark complexioned man get in a carriage with Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so, and they took off for town in a real big hurry in their carriage. So the bounty hunters were on alert. They hurried back to the hotel, got their guns. They got the local constable, who was a Mr. Hertz. And he also had been raised in the South, so they again assumed he was a Southern sympathizer. Well, they took the constable with him, and they got back before that carriage came back to Birmingham. And out stepped one of the preachers that was to be part of the revival later. And they realized they'd been skunked. Later, someone asked Hurt about this incident, and Mr. Hurt said, if I had found the fellow those gentlemen were looking for, I would have given him a loaf of bread, a sack of apples, and shown him the easy road to Salem. So I come from a little further south of here, 20 miles south of Fairfield is Keosauqua. Keosauqua is 8 miles north of the Missouri border. And our Benjamin Franklin Pierson was raised a Quaker in Pennsylvania. And we do not have any details of what his family might have been involved in, but they were Quakers, and that usually is enough said, like Methodists or Free Presbyterians. And there is a hiding place that was built into the house under the floorboards. Also at Salem, that was a Quaker settlement. There were several hiding places that were built into trapdoor hiding places under the floor. So every one of these people, we were having a conversation earlier about birds of a feather flock together. And so all these people knew each other, and they had connections from out east, and they gained more friends that were like-minded. You could bring that chart up now, please. Anyone, and this is not something anybody can read unless you're standing right beside it, but I will bring this to have at the Carnegie Museum. This is the Des Moines River, and at Keosauqua, which is down here at the bottom, is the big horseshoe bend. There's another little horseshoe bend, and then it goes on to the edge of the county. Salem is about a foot away from the eastern border of Van Buren County. So you can see it was quite close. But 8 miles, southern state of Missouri, the slaves came up, and there were I keep finding more references to Underground Railroad activity and places. They came up through here. Here's Birmingham. This area had a lot of Underground Railroad activity. So the house that Mr. Pierson built, they had a back door that the slaves would have come through. There was no neon sign to say, safe house. And so we know that there were conductors that brought the runaways there. And some of the enslaved people freed themselves and came north, but they found people who were sympathetic to them and helped them on their way. And I would invite you to come and visit our Underground Railroad house and also the Salem. Isn't it remarkable? We have 2 Underground Railroad places so close together here. Thank you.
Now, our third out-of-town expert is Joy Lapp from Mount Pleasant.
Let's see. Get my notes. So I want to say a little bit about this guy named Samuel Howe. And I didn't know anything about abolitionist activity in Mount Pleasant until this winter when I met Mark Schaefer and I read something from Rory Goff, who made a reference to Samuel Howe. And I had heard of Samuel Howe as an educator, and he had a school in Mount Pleasant, an academy called Howe's Academy. But I looked up an article in the Annals of Iowa, which is the publication of the Historic Society of Iowa. And in reference to Samuel Howe, it says this: at a very early period, his house was a station on the Underground Railroad, the first one north of Salem. And Mount Pleasant is about 10 miles north of Salem. Many a poor colored man, woman, and child did he help on their way from slavery to freedom, bidding them Godspeed, not with loving and encouraging words alone, but also with transportation, money, food, and clothing. And then it goes on to say, but as a free soiler and an abolitionist, he was bitterly hated and had to endure the wickedest persecution. But he was every whit a hero fit to be named with the classic martyrs of the past. His property was destroyed, his stock stolen, emissaries were sent to take his life, and finally he was brutally mobbed by the pro-slavery ruffians in the streets of Mount Pleasant. I've heard my venerable mother, and this was written by a son of Samuel Howe after his death. So he says, I've heard my venerable mother, now 84 years old, often say that she expected to see him brought home dead almost any day, a victim to the deadly malice of the pro-slavery men. And so he was actually born in Vermont, and then he was raised in Ohio. He became an educator in Ohio, and he started an academy there. One of his students in Ohio was General Sherman. And there's a quote from General Sherman who later said, the best teacher in the United States is Samuel Howe. Wow. Then he came to Henry County, Iowa. He started a school. They first just had a little log cabin. He started a school in the log cabin in 1840. Then in 1843, they moved into town, which wasn't much of a town at that point in time. And the location he found for his school at that point was the second story of the jail. So they said they could look down and see the prisoners, and they could look up and see heaven. And then later, they built a school, and this is a map of Mount Pleasant in 1869. You can see this is the public school, and next to it is Howe's Academy. And so when it mentions that at his house, Samuel Howe lived here at the school. So this must be the station that they're talking about. And it's through Howe's Academy that freedom seekers were helped on their way. And there's a photograph of Howe's Academy. So this was started in 1845 and extended for a number of years in Mount Pleasant. Now, since I have an opportunity to, one more thing I wanted to say about Howe. There was the first abolitionist newspaper in Iowa was called the Iowa Freeman, Fort Madison. And Samuel Howe became a stockholder in the paper, and then it was later moved to Mount Pleasant. And for a number of years, he published that newspaper in Mount Pleasant, Iowa. So I'm on the Historic Preservation Commission, and we have not really done very much of this research like you all have done. But there is so much out there waiting for us, to work on. And I wanted to mention that in Mount Pleasant is the oldest African American church west of the Mississippi. And you can drive through Mount Pleasant and you can find Second Baptist Church at the corner of Saunders and Van Buren, I think it is. There's a sign in front. 1863 is when this church was established. We have a photograph of what it looked like in 1909. It was a small building. Later, it was extended. And the Second Baptist congregation is still an active congregation in Mount Pleasant, but in 2007 they bought another building. They gave the historic building to the city, so we're now responsible for it, and we're hoping to make a museum of the African American history of Mount Pleasant in this building. And we have this great, you can't see, but this great photograph. In 1947, the congregation all stood out front after church. And this great photograph. And Mount Pleasant, I mean, there's a lot to put in a museum in Mount Pleasant. In the census, if you look in census records, after each person it says white, black, or mulatto. And so you can go through the census of Mount Pleasant. And in someplace I put the numbers here, 1850, there were 0 that were marked black or mulatto. 1860, there were maybe 18 people. By 1870, there were almost 300 black or mulatto people in Mount Pleasant. 10 years later, almost 400. So as people were leaving the South, after the Emancipation Proclamation and after the war, people were headed north. And Mount Pleasant was a place that for a long time many people found a home, and thus Second Baptist Church that was started in Mount Pleasant. And a couple of years ago, last summer actually, we found this pamphlet, The Colored Man of America as a Slave and a Citizen, Moses Mosley, and then it says Mount Pleasant, Henry County, Iowa, published in 1884. And Moses Mosley was a former slave who came and settled in Mount Pleasant. A number of his brothers and sisters settled there. He had 5 children. And he stayed in Mount Pleasant almost until his death. And so when you read obituaries of these people, you learn so much information. His mother also Agnes Mosley ended up in Mount Pleasant. In her obituary, it mentioned she had been separated from her children at some point in time. It says, but she saved $500 and purchased her freedom. And then somehow, I don't know, there were avenues of communication. She found her children in Mount Pleasant, and then she lived in Mount Pleasant until her death. Moses Mosley's daughter, Susan Mosley Grandison, was the first African-American graduate of Iowa Wesleyan College, which is in Mount Pleasant. So there's a lot of very interesting stuff that we can find about Moses Mosley. And we hope in a couple of years that we're going to have a museum to tell the story of the African American history of Mount Pleasant.
There we go. How's that? Is that okay?
Point it down.
There we go. Okay, thank you very much, Joy. And we have a document in our collection relevant to the McElhinny family. It's a slave narrative published in 1865 or 6, and it was published in Mount Pleasant by the Freedmen's Society. So we'll be anxious to find out how that fits in. Basically today is kind of a memorial service. From here on out, we're going to discuss the various burials at Evergreen and the old Fairfield Cemetery that will be honored with the placement of the Juneteenth flags today. There are at least 4 African American graves. Some of them are husband-wife combinations, so it's more than just 4 people. But we're going to be honoring 3 of those individuals. One is Nancy Yancey, and then 2 are Civil War veterans of men of color. So Jenny Sammons is going to read the little bio on Nancy Yancey.
So, can you hear me?
No, not really.
Okay.
Let me see here.
So, Nancy Yancey, She and her husband James were the first African American couple to settle in Fairfield at around 1857. Mrs. Yancey had been born into slavery. After achieving her freedom, she studied at Oberlin, the first college to admit women and people of color. Her laundry and his barber shop provided ideal cover for their work as Underground Railroad station masters. James is buried in Arkansas, and she died in 1903.
And then Paul Gandy is going to discuss the two Civil War vets that are buried in Evergreen.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
I'm just not going to read this. You can't expect me just to read this after all of this. I want to show my appreciation. I'm very grateful for the work of Mark Schaefer and the entire Carnegie Museum Foundation for putting on this really significant event. So thank you. And at this wonderful house, the McElhinny House.
Yeah.
My cousin is very much into genealogy, and he travels the South going to courthouses and talking with families to trace our family heritage, which goes back generations and includes people from all different backgrounds, as you can imagine, in the South. And he tells me the story of, on the phone, talking with I believe it was the Vicksburg's Women's History Society. He was calling them from Detroit, and they didn't know who he was, and he's like me, and so they set up a meeting for him to travel to Vicksburg and to meet with them and discuss the history of Vicksburg. We have lineage that has connections with that southern city. So he always tells me the story that when he came into the meeting, they were surprised to see him. But it turned out to be a meaningful and useful conversation, and he gained a lot of knowledge, and I think they appreciated it as well. So what I want to read to you are the grave sites, or a little bit about two of the people who are buried here in Fairfield, who are African Americans and are closely associated with the freedom-seeking movement. Robert Wynn. Mr. Wynn was born in Virginia and at the age of 3 taken to Missouri. He was the last Uyghur passenger to be ferried across the Skunk River. This occurred in 1862 or early 1863 near Clay, Washington County. On September 14, 1863, Wynn enlisted as a private with Company D of the 1st Iowa Infantry Volunteers. Henry Stewart. In February 1923, the Women's Relief Corps honored Civil War veterans at a Lincoln dinner. Mr. Stewart recalled having shaken hands with Abraham Lincoln in 1858. That occurred at the time of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. He also served with the 1st Iowa Volunteers, later named the 60th U.S. Colored Infantry.
We've got some music.
Okay. So yeah, I'm really glad to be here today. I've been actually studying my family history as well, and now I've become fascinated by history, and being in Fairfield, Iowa has been especially enriching to have that museum here. So I come from the enslaved people, but my family is from Virginia. So like they came over on the Mayflower. My family has been from Virginia since the 1600s, and so it's pretty fascinating to learn about all of that and to sort of come into my own as an American.
Excellent.
So I'm gonna sing "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot," the first verse, and then I'm going to sing the second and third verses in between as interludes. And feel free to sing along if you know the words. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Jordan. I looked over Jordan, and what did I see? Coming for to carry me home. A band of angels coming after me, coming for to carry me home.
Thank you. That's Sally Hayes. Come on up, Sally. So Sally and I are
Loosely related.
distantly related by marriage. My great uncle, my mother's dad's sister, married her great grandparents' first cousin. Twice removed.
Yeah, Quakers. So I'm going to read about some people here, but as an intro to me, I was born in Fairfield, raised in Richland. My husband was raised in Fairfield as well, and all four of our parents have Quaker heritage. That's amazing to me when I did the family tree. But his grandmother was a Pickard. All the Salem people were, a lot of them were Pickards on that wall. And went in the Llewellyn house and went, Terrace family, all of them. And my family's the Hinshaws from Richland, and that's the direct Quaker line for me. And my family was involved in the Underground Railroad. So that's my interest in this. And I'm not going to say these names properly, but I'll do my best. Mehetable Woods, 1813 to 1891, known as Auntie Woods, was a heroine of the American Civil War. She was known as the Clara Barton of Jefferson County. She organized collection and shipment of tons of food, medicine, and other supplies to her boys at the front. She held the rank of major in the Army. I think that's amazing.
Yeah. And she's the one on the big rock in front of the courthouse.
So then there's Isabella Burkett. Mrs. Burkett, her husband and children were dedicated conductors and station masters. Her bundles of food, stashed in an abandoned slaughterhouse just north of what is today Evergreen Cemetery, provided sustenance for freedom seekers on the trek to Canada. She was Presbyterian, he was Quaker. Both had significant Underground Railroad connections with friends and family.
Thank you. And Sally's great-great-grandparents, Jesse and Julia Hinshaw, actually ran a station out of their farm. And you'll see there, I've got a label that's dedicated to them at our exhibit. Our next speaker is Richard Thompson, and I owe him a big debt of gratitude, because for years he did all this genealogy stuff for Find a Grave. And a lot of your information, you're not David. I'm burned out. Anyway, Richard, I appreciate all the work you've done over the years. Made our job a little easier. So if you tell us about Christian Slagle and W.W. Junkin.
I've been out to Old Fairfield City Cemetery and Evergreen Cemetery, photographing an awful lot of headstones. And I've got about 36,000 headstone pictures in total that I've posted. And it's so fun to learn the stories. Christian Slagle is buried out at Old Fairfield City Cemetery. 1821 to 1882, he was an early trustee of the University of Iowa and instrumental in the founding of the public library and museum. Mr. Slagle was an organizer of the first Iowa State Fair in 1854. He was a Congregationalist who espoused abolition and temperance. The current Fairfield Public Library stands on the site of his home. W.W. Junkin, who Andy back here might kind of know about because he founded the Fairfield Ledger. 1831 to 1903, William Wallace Junkin was the editor of the Fairfield Ledger. He started work there in 1853. For the next 50 years, Mr. Junkin was outspoken in his opposition to slavery. He was a staunch Methodist and a temperance man.
Thank you, sir.
If I might be permitted a very slight diversion, since a number of you will be going out to Evergreen Cemetery, there's somebody buried out there that I'm not going to give her name, except it was Nancy, but you'll have to kind of do your own research. But we're here today because a certain president, I don't think it's me, a certain president, Abraham Lincoln, did all of the things that we're commemorating today. Sorry. In the future. Sorry about that. But anyway, we all know about Abraham Lincoln. And we know that James F. Wilson and others that we'll be talking about knew Abraham Lincoln back in the day. Well, there's also a fabled story that when Abraham Lincoln, before he was president, before he became a lawyer, well, he had to kind of start out, so he kind of thought about being a lawyer and everything, and he lived in, I believe it was East Salem, Illinois, and he had to eat. So he went around and he wound up eating at this house, breakfast, morning, dinner, whatnot. And the fable is that he fell in love with this young girl. And about 3 years later, she died. And that was his first love of his life, the fable goes. But she actually existed, and her family actually existed. The mother is actually buried down in Van Buren County, along with a brother. But the woman's sister is buried out here at Evergreen Cemetery. And I'll let you kind of figure out, you'll have to do your own research to figure out who it was. But she came out here. So every once in a while when I go giving tours of Evergreen Cemetery for genealogy with somebody, and we'll kind of walk around, and I'll go, you see that grave? Yeah. So Abraham Lincoln used to have breakfast with her when she was young. So that's part of our connection.
Second verse.
Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. If you get there before I do. If you get there before I do, coming for to carry me home. Just tell my friends I'm coming too, coming for to carry me home.
So that previous round of graves is in the old Fairfield Cemetery, which is the west half of what we generally think of as Evergreen. So these last 5 or so graves are from Evergreen itself, which wasn't founded until 1870. So Herb, if you'd come and share about
That's right.
the guy that's not our relative. Oh, Jenny's got the,
Thank you.
your L. Other side. Or no, that's.
Dr. Joshua
Yes,
Schaefer
thank you.
came to Fairfield from Pennsylvania in 1852. Like many abolitionists, he spurned the imbibing of alcohol. He was one of the founders of the Iowa State Fair and won first prize for taxidermy at the second state fair, also held in Fairfield. The Carnegie Historical Museum preserves scores of examples of his work. They truly are ancient in their appearance and worth your perusal. Dr. Schaefer donated his natural history collection in 1895.
Sally, did you know you're on again? Okay. I'm here. Want to make sure you're still here.
I can go out to lunch once in a while.
That's right. So you're M.
Yeah, who I'm going to talk about is Joseph McKimmy, 1815 to 1898. Mr. McKimmy helped found the Jefferson County Wide Awakes in 1860. They sponsored torchlight parades in support of Lincoln. He was deeply opposed to slavery. So I'm going to make a note on the next gentleman. His last name is Mendenhall, and that is a huge name in the Quaker family. Trust me, Mendenhalls are everywhere. Get this, listen tight. Daniel Mendenhall, 1819 to 1873, and Quakers are pacifists, remember. He was the first gunsmith to settle in Fairfield. He and Susanna resided in a log house later occupied by the Presbyterian Church. Mr. Mendenhall sold guns as fast as he could make them during the California Gold Rush of 1849. Naughty Quaker.
So Herb, you're up again. You have it?
James F. Wilson, 1828 to 1895. The Wilson home and office block are on the National Register of Historic Places. As an Iowa state legislator, he gained the reputation for being, quote, a friend to the slave. During service as representative from Iowa's 1st District, he gave Lincoln official word of re-election in 1865. Wilson was also among the dignitaries who rode the funeral train from Washington, D.C. to Springfield for burial. He was a co-sponsor of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. And finally, on my part, George Knight, 1821 to 1885. He lived in Blackhawk Township when he was in Iowa, a farmer who represents abolitionists which are otherwise unknown to us. Many abolitionists thought it imprudent to brag upon a contribution to a moral cause. Others simply wanted to befriend those with whom they had had animosity in the past so that we could again be one nation under God together. A letter he wrote from Philadelphia to a cousin in England came to light a couple of months ago. Mr. Knight wrote that letter 10 years before coming west in the early 1850s. In his correspondence, he recounts the horrors of race riots as the fruit of slavery. In his own hand, he states, slavery should be abolished. This is his letter dated in 1838 from his home at the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Our great-great-grandfather. So that too. That makes it special. Okay, one last tune.
Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. I'm sometimes up, I'm sometimes down. I'm sometimes up, I'm sometimes down, coming for to carry me home. But still my soul feels heavenly bound, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home.
Yeah, just tip it down, I think. Thank you, sir. So we're going to end this program with an excerpt from a speech that James Yancey gave at the Emancipation Day celebration in Des Moines. in 1866, I think. Anyway, this is Nancy Yancey's husband. He died a few years after that, so she raised the remaining 6 kids alone. But he became known as quite an orator and was mentioned several times in the Fairfield Ledger. W.W. Junkin, even after emancipation, continued the struggle for better race relations and equal justice for all. James Yancey was in favor of universal suffrage for blacks and whites, for men and women, a good half century before women actually did get the right to vote. So very forward-thinking man, very powerful man. So I'm anxious to hear what Paul has picked out, what excerpts to read, because it's a long speech, and I don't think we have time to hear all of it. So, but here's Mr. Gandy.
Mark is right. The speech was given, I believe, August 1st, 1866 in Des Moines. And what they were doing then is celebrating Emancipation Day of December of 1834, which was celebrating the British West Indies emancipation. Because you see, enslavement was abolished in the West Indies, in the Caribbean, long before it was in the United States. And so that was a celebration, or a celebratory event that was taking place that day. But of course, what he said was relevant to our country because it was 1866, and we had both the Emancipation Proclamation and also Juneteenth, the very first one. Mr. Yancey, as Mark said, quite a remarkable man, a man ahead of his time, I think. And you need those. There are people like that, and he was one of them. Who am I? I've been in Fairfield for almost 40 years. I'm a transplant, but I like being here. I learned a lot coming to Fairfield. I mean, I was raised around the country, including in the South, including in Texas, but there's some things I learned in Fairfield I didn't know anywhere else. A couple of years ago, and this is a prelude to what I want to read here, a couple of years ago, I went on a field trip to Salem, Massachusetts. Of course, Salem, as you know, was a town that was, I think, initially founded specifically for the purpose of being an underground railroad station. Just 25 miles north of Missouri, it was designed for that purpose in mind. I mean, that wasn't obviously the explicit purpose because they didn't want to give too much notice that people would be running to try to catch people, but that was the purpose, and it was founded by Quakers. And so I had the opportunity to visit some of the houses and also some of the crawl spaces where they would hide freedom seekers. And I also learned how powerful language is. This is the first time that I recall ever hearing the word freedom seeker, the phrase freedom seeker, because in the South, what you would normally hear is the word or phrase runaway slave. But that presumed they were doing something wrong. These people were doing something wrong. They were breaking the law. But instead, they were running from something rather than going towards something. They were going toward freedom. And that really made a difference to me. The other thing that I learned, the other word I learned is they used the word enslaved in Salem, not the word slave. Slave to me suggests sort of a permanent condition, whereas enslavement is a temporary condition that can be changed and you can become free, whereas if you're a slave, it's more or less a lifetime sort of predicament, if you will, and even though you may change that legally, there's still that taint. So that language, the change in words really made a difference to me, and I learned that from being in Fairfield and from visiting Salem. It's something I think Iowa can be very proud about. The selection I wanted to read, and Mark is wondering, it's a very long speech. And if you recall, in those days, 1865, people tended to be the language tended to be more ornate, more flowery, if you will. And this is no exception. But the section I'm reading, I think, is very powerful, and it actually resonates with something our mayor said earlier today in her toast. See if you can pick out the similarity. Her toast was something like, we have always been striving to be a more perfect union, a more perfect union. Not perfect yet, not perfect still, but let's see if we can find or pick from the words I'm going to read to you whether or not that idea was still prevalent in 1866. The revolutionary fathers of this our much beloved but sinful republic had planted the good seed of true principles as embodied in that immortal Declaration of Independence, which they set forth to the world, informing them that these were the principles on which they intended to build a republic, declaring that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are born equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And to secure those rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Upon these immortal truths, they founded a government by forming a constitution, pure as the truth of the declaration they had made, throwing its benign folds of protection around the liberties of the humblest citizen. A beautiful superstructure they had raised upon that impregnable foundation of imperishable truth. But there was a deadly, poisonous serpent hard by the cradle of this beautiful infant republic. Its name was slavery. It was thought to be effeminate in constitution and ephemeral in existence, and could not live under such a pure government as this long enough to do any harm. Instead of bringing down the sword of justice which the Constitution had raised over its fated head, with deadly intent and patriotic determination, to slay the monster while it was yet a child and undeveloped, they humored the child with its strange infatuation. It was acknowledged by many, too, that all the provisions of that Constitution would not be carried out till slavery was destroyed. But the infant was determined to persist in its strange fancy, to pet the little monster till it died for want of suitable nourishment to prolong its life. But instead of dying it by degrees gained strength, and by degrees infused its deadly poison into the child's constitution, and with its fascinating gaze had well nigh charmed and swallowed it entirely up. By this time they feared to attack it as belligerents. Its strength had increased so much that it roared with fearful volume, and raised up with such terrific aspect that they cowered before it, and dared not stir up its wrath. Seeing its advantage, for it was quick of perception, it demanded of the expounders of the constitutional law a favorable construction of the Constitution in order to establish its legal existence in this country. This brings us down to the present crisis. That serpent, which has grown old and defiant, was slain by the sword and the Proclamation of Freedom issued by President Abraham Lincoln. Although the Proclamation of Freedom was but a partial one, it gave slavery a mortal wound, and I verily believe, judging from the course that our Congress has since pursued, that with the exercise of all the medical science and surgical skill of the usurper, with President Johnson, the modern Moses at the head, will not be able to save it from inevitable death. Thus you see that we, as an oppressed people, have great reason to be thankful to God and the powers that be for what has been done in our behalf. But in saying this, I do not mean that we are satisfied with mere theoretical or nominal freedom. We believe that the Creator designed his intelligent and reasonable creature, man, should have, and indeed commanded it, the privilege to choose their rulers from among themselves, just men, that would rule in righteousness, agreeing perfectly with the almost inspired Jefferson, the great apostle of liberty, in his ideas of a just government, which was that governments are initiated among men, deriving from that just power from the consent of the governed. Iowa has a lot to be proud about. We've made a tremendous amount of progress from here, from there, to where we are today. And there's progress more to be made, and we are making it. Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much for being here.
So we have options. We're going to process to Evergreen Cemetery and take the banner here up beside me and place it on Nancy Yancey's grave. You'll be able to read her gravestone from the car if you know where to look, and with the flag that'll help you out. But if you scan the cemetery, you'll be able to see the flags that are already been put out by our board members. I think somebody's going to hang out at cemetery for a while. If anybody wants to actually walk through, is there anybody that want to do that today? If you do, let Joe Hunt know. He's at the door. And the flags will be up until July 4th. So you can come back on a cool evening or whatever with your map and do the walkthrough yourself. One of the purposes of this program here, I wanted to give you kind of a background so you can, when you come to the museum and look at the exhibit, you'll have a better core understanding of what has been put together. And we're still not done. It's like information, like Joy was saying, things, and Christy, things just walk in the door and you think, oh my gosh, that's great, but I don't have time for any more information. Anyway, one of the things that's really exciting, and I do not have this labeled yet, we have things in the collection like the Schaefer taxidermy that has been there in some cases for 120 years, that in a sense is the grandchild of abolition. The people that made that museum possible were committed to freedom for all people. And that's terribly exciting to know that our entire collection cross-references itself to the abolition of slavery. And I find that very, very inspiring. And my final hope for this exhibit and this whole venture into the history of the Underground Railroad in this area is when you look at how contentious our times are, you hear people say, oh, we've never been so divided. Well, I won't tell you what it is, so you can just fill in the blank. We've been divided and contentious many times over. But in today's climate, no matter how far you are to the right or the left or someplace in the middle, everybody thinks slavery was a bad thing. And this is something we can come together on and celebrate the fact that we crushed the serpent's head and we're still dealing with the kind of the aftershocks of that terrible institution. But a holiday like this and an educational exhibit like this is an attempt to heal those wounds and to look forward and beyond to our better selves. So thank you again for coming. You can follow us to the cemetery or go directly to the museum or go home and come back later. It's up to you. Thanks again.